What's up, comrades? Welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. We're coming at you with part 2 this week of our mini-series on Ernest Mandel's An Introduction to Marxist Economic Theory. For this episode, we're going to be reviewing a little bit of the last proof of the labor theory of value that we ended on in part 1. We're going to talk about the various competing theories of value, the transition from pre-capitalist society to capitalist modes of production. We're going to talk about the Animatrix, Lord of the Rings, concrete capital, variable capital, and all sorts of other good stuff. I am also very pleased to announce that starting today, on this Mini Squared series episode, we're going to be introducing a new short segment with contributions from our beautiful, lovely patron comrades from across the globe called Ask Adorno. I'm not going to give you any spoilers, but you can expect the new segment to show up on today and all future Mini Squared series episodes near the end of our discussion portion. And on that note, I want to give a big shout out to all of our new patrons that are now supporting Red Library. We see you all. We recognize you. We honor you. We pledge our fealty to you. That's a little intense. I don't know if you really wanted our fealty pledged, but you got it, like it or not. That's part of our perks. We're working our way up to 50 patrons. That's been our goal for quite some time, and I'm very happy to say that we are on the way there very fast. Before we jump into the episode today, please remember to keep supporting Red Library in any number of ways that we offer you. If you would like to become a patron, you can find a link to our page in the show notes, or it's just patreon.com/redlibrary, and for as little as $1 per month or a quarter per episode, you will get access to all of our premium content, our Discord server, and potentially being able to contribute to new show segments such as Ask Adorno and whatever else we come up with in the future. Remember, if you're listening on iTunes, please give us one of those star reviews. Write us a couple of lines, as that is really helping to spread the show around and help us reach many, many new potential comrades out there. Like the show on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and so on and so on and so on. All right, here's me and the other half of our tag team, the Legion of Doomers, Comrade Commissar Don, tackling part 2 of Ernest Mandel's An Introduction to Marxist Economic Theory. We'll see you back here afterward. All right. What's up, comrade patrons? Oh, shit. No, never mind. Sorry, let me try that again. What's up, comrades? Welcome to this week's episode of Red Library. We are here. It's me and my tag team partner. Together, we make up the Intercontinental Heavyweight Champs of wrestling, of theoretical wrestling, and we are the Legion of Doomers.
Like, yeah, absolutely.
It's really stuck with me that you've been listening to the 10-hour Doomer mixes,
the Russian
Doomer mixes. So
yeah, that's great.
I wanted to shoehorn them.
Unironically, I like it.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna put some of this in the background, maybe of the intro here.
Yeah,
and maybe I'll post some links so if people want to get down with some Russian Doomer mixes, they can know where to go.
Yeah.
All right. Are you ready to make these podcasts?
Let's start the podcast factory.
Yeah, man. I'm flipping on the switch right now. It's really uneventful.
No, nothing really happened.
Yeah, nothing really happened at all, actually. I mean, I guess me hitting record, that's kind of starting the machines in the podcast factory.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know, man. I feel like I'm really pushing this whole podcast factory thing as far as it's going to go.
It would be much better if it was like an actual mechanical switch. You'd have some sort of physical feedback when you actually push it. True. That might be better. Yeah.
Well, maybe for the part 3 of the Mandel, for the final part, we'll have some arbitrary switch that I flip.
It doesn't actually do anything, but it's symbolic. It's a symbolic flipping.
Yeah. Isn't that the nature of all human experience, though? Subjectivity is you flip the switch, nothing is actually happening, but you have the feeling that something is happening.
I guess, sure.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like I need to think about that longer before I can actually answer.
No. Just keep going. Just don't think about it.
I'll be honest. I think you can probably cut this entire part from the actual episode.
Yeah, that's true.
Or, you can leave it. I don't care.
We'll see how it goes.
You can leave it in.
We'll see how long this is, considering our first part was an hour and 5 minutes.
Yeah, for a mini episode. Yeah.
For a mini episode, yeah. Well, should we get right down to the business?
Sure.
You. All right. Well, we're here to pick up on old Ernie Mandel's An introduction to Marxist economic theory. I feel like part 1, funny enough, is I thought it went really well. It's apparently our most downloaded episode already. So,
cool.
Which either means we really tapped into the zeitgeist, or all of our other episodes are just really irrelevant. I'm not sure which way to interpret this.
Yeah, well, whatever. I don't think.
That's right. I'm not one to.
Yeah, I'm not going to overanalyze it.
Yeah, that's
analyze it at all.
Yeah, actually, I agree. Let's just completely not analyze what this means at all. Pure American pragmatism.
There you go. I think we wanted to. There were some things we wanted to talk about from episode 1 before we get into the second chapter, though, right?
Yeah, we wanted to review the last proof of the labor theory of value, the reduction to the absurd, because we actually had a lot of listener comments and some things on our YouTube channel. People were just giving us some feedback. It sounds like it was kind of a tricky one for a lot of folks, so we wanted to just try to clarify that one a little bit more.
Cool. Well, I mean, I was going to clarify what my main, because I didn't actually read any of those comments. I just thought about it more over the past couple weeks.
That's good enough.
And wanted to clarify my issue with it. So I don't know if you actually have like a response to my questions or not, but my general point was essentially that there's a lot of things that I think one of our patrons put it well, which was that it's like a necessary but not sufficient condition for it. And that was kind of how I felt about it. Was like, essentially you could say that, well, without oxygen, there would be no value because all humanity would be dead without oxygen, but it doesn't necessarily mean that oxygen is like the same thing as labor or as value. So
that's some accelerationist shit. I like that. True Russian doomer shit right there.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, yeah, like it's like we like, I didn't think he made at least in his description of it, like a clear enough connection between, what labor would be and why it was like necessary in this definition.
I guess rereading that section and thinking about it and checking out some of the comments, I mean, my understanding was just that it's sort of a logical consequence of basically defining value specifically in the labor theory of value and saying that exchange value, i.e. the creation of surplus value from labor being enacted upon the material inputs, that essentially if that's your starting point, that if you can't imagine any sort of value without that labor being part of it. And so basically, if we could just imagine that all production, all services, all that stuff is fully automated, we have a very hard time imagining how we would be able to assign value to things that are produced or services in the same way. So I don't know if maybe we're thinking about this too hard.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Or maybe it's just kind of inherent. It's not really that clear. I mean, to me, it seems fairly graspable of like, yeah, okay, if I could imagine like basically everything being automated completely, however sort of abstract or utopian that is. I mean, I can see like, yeah, I guess I would probably have a hard time figuring out like how prices and value would necessarily work with the same kind of commodities and services the way that we understand them now. I mean, I can see that. I mean, yeah, whether I find that a sort of airtight proof.
No, correct my understanding if it's wrong. I think his point wasn't necessarily, because like I think for automation, there would still obviously be labor that went into creating the machines and producing them. I think the argument was essentially that because nobody was getting paid any longer, nobody was having like any resources to actually consume the products, then they wouldn't have any value, right?
Yeah, well, I guess I don't necessarily see him as saying that the price, like the wages are the things, like it's all about what people are buying. It's essentially that, like the whole idea of why there are wages and why things cost as much as they do in the first place is really determined by like how much exploitation is happening of the people who are working. So I guess it maybe is kind of like, where are you putting the focus in the whole process of production and labor? And my reading of him is just that, yeah, it's like, it's almost that, yeah, there wouldn't be any wages per se that people are using or making to then buy commodities, and so nothing would have value. It's more about just the way that all of that sort of process would necessarily happen in the level of production versus in the level of what Marx would call circulation or the realization of surplus value, which is basically whenever we're actually buying shit in the marketplace.
Okay.
Well, let me give you this, because this is a quote I found at the end, and I don't know if we read this in the first part, but this is straight Mandel. He's about to spit it.
Okay.
Spit, Mandel, spit. Expressed another way, a society in which human labor would be totally eliminated from production, and the most general sense of the term, with services included, would be a society in which exchange value had also been eliminated. This proves the validity of the theory, for at that moment, human labor disappears from production, value too disappears with it. So basically, it's that if you were to eliminate human labor completely, and I guess ideally in this sort of abstract sort of a proof, even like the production of the machines and the maintenance of the machines, that would also somehow be automated. I mean, this is straight up like Animatrix shit. Did you ever see the Animatrix?
I watched part of it, and then I think it was like late at night, and I fell asleep, and then I never went back and watched the rest of it.
Well, it's too bad, because really the last third of it, all it is just trying to prove Mandel's theorem here. So,
well, shit, yeah. Okay.
It was really surprising.
If only I would have known at the time.
That was really where like the Wachowskis just like really got fucking radical. They're like, all right, we're going to sneak this in the last third of the Animatrix. No one's going to know that we're going to flesh out the reduction to the absurd and the labor theory of value. But I guess reading this, it's just to me that this all seems to hinge for me on just the elimination of exchange value. And once exchange value is gone, pretty much value in general disappears with it. And exchange value only exists because human labor is being utilized on the production of commodities. I don't know. Is that, maybe we're just talking in circles here at this point?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm still not convinced entirely, but I remain open to being convinced.
Okay.
So.
Well, let's put this on the shelf, and then maybe we'll come back to it throughout. But
sure.
That's really the best. I don't even know if I buy it either, but I'm just trying to at least flesh out what the argument is. That's the best shot I have at actually fleshing out the argument. So,
fair. And with this in mind, I think that there was a couple questions that I wanted to ask in relation to this, just as this is like kind of an intro, or it's supposed to be an intro for people new to Marxist thought. So I kind of wanted to ask, what are the other competing forms of the theory of value? Because I think that might be interesting to at least discuss a little bit of, if you don't buy the Marxist theory of value, the labor theory of value, then what are the other options, right? I mean, I'll say that I only know of basically one other one that I've really ever interacted with people about, right? Which seems to be just the value of items are just due to essentially demand and market forces, which to me I've always been dissatisfied with, because it essentially, again, maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but to me it just becomes essentially a tautology, right? An item is worth what it costs because that's what people are willing to pay for it. And it essentially tells us, I mean, it's basically it is what it is type of description, because it doesn't actually tell you any extra information about why an item might be expensive or not, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, so just researching these a little bit, the two main competing theories that I know of are one is called the intrinsic theory of value, which is just basically kind of accepting that things are inherently valuable in themselves.
Okay.
And then the other would be the subjective theory of value, which is much more a sort of consumer-driven theory of value. So basically consumers, the demand that consumers have, how much symbolic value they place on items, that's essentially what creates the conception we have of value. So I guess one way I think about it is that the subjective theory of value, or the consumer side, is definitely much more sort of modern neoclassical economics. Yeah. And the labor theory of value is much more driven by saying that value is created in the realm of the producer, of the worker. And so to me, maybe part of it is like, okay, the thing in itself creates the value. That's the intrinsic theory of value. The labor theory of value says the producer creates the value, and then the subjective theory would say the consumer, who ends up basically, consuming the commodity, that's who creates the value. Okay. So I see those as, kind of a sort of a tripartite way to think about it, just sort of like consumer, producer, or the thing in itself is what creates how much value we ascribe to things.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Cool.
And I just want to say those other two are fucking trash.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to talk about, because, I would say that there's in some cases where I don't necessarily think the labor of theory of value seems to capture maybe everything about the price of a commodity, and yet I still think it has better explanatory power than the other competing ones. Yeah,
I think that's how I feel about it too. It isn't to say that it doesn't have weaknesses, or it isn't completely universal in everything that it describes. But I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit biased because I'm a fucking Marxist, but yeah, to me, it still does seem to hold the most powerful explanation of why is it that we ascribe value to things in the way that we do compared to the other two theories.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And so I guess the last question I wanted to talk about before we move on to chapter 2 in Mandel would be, so what exactly do you think is the importance of the labor theory of value for Marxist theory? Like why does this become such a contentious piece of Marxist thought? Why does this kind of end up being a battleground? Because it obviously seems like it ends up being very important because there are so many disagreements and arguments around it. So it must be a very important part of the puzzle. And I kind of wanted to explore of why is it that important part of the puzzle, and what is kind of, what are the stakes of this disagreement?
Man, it's a big question, but it's an important one and a really good one. I would say that in my study of Marx, and this question in particular, to me, I think I want to come at this sort of two different ways, sort of one internal to Marx's theoretical development, and then the other in relationship between Marx and the competing theories and the landscape of political economy at the time that he wrote Kapital, and then the Grundrisse and sort of the early instantiations of his labor theory of value and sort of his approach to economics. So we're talking mid 1850s to 1867, whenever Das Kapital Volume 1 was published. So I would say that internal to Marx, there is at least some story that Marx started off being much more focused on sort of the impact of capitalist production on the experience of people, like the sort of general human experience, and the whole sort of critique was focused on the experience of alienation. And this is in the Paris manuscripts, the economic manuscripts of 1844, is the idea that, well, basically you're going to critique the violence, the systemic violence of capital by basically looking at how does it basically cut off what Marx would call our species being, our ability to be fully developed, fully expansive subjects. And it basically severely limits that and creates the experience of alienation. So it's very much focused, at least the idea is in this sort of humanistic kind of way. Now, the story, again, how much you buy this, I don't really buy this, but the story is that as Marx proceeded to develop his theory of capital that would, basically make up Capital's Volume 1, 2, and 3, is that essentially he realized that wasn't a strong enough criticism and was still buying into certain assumptions of the exact kind of theories that he was critiquing, and some other things going on in different kinds of socialism and anarchism at the time. But basically that essentially he was looking to create a much more scientific, rigorous, objective way to describe the process of capital and what it does to workers. And so I think the point was to say that the focus on the labor theory of value was very specifically to provide a much more objective scientific description about sort of the logic of a systemic process versus focusing on the human impact of what capital does. Now, the other thing that I would just throw out is that I think at the time there were a lot of debates and a lot of perspectives on where does profit come from, or what is the nature of capitalist production. And I think that Marx's focus on the labor theory of value, to me, is really a focus on how is it that exploitation happens? Where does profit come from? And one of the really beautiful ways that Marx describes this in the start of Capital Volume 1 is to say that if you were just to walk through the marketplace, right, you just show up with money in your hand to buy a commodity, that basically it obscures, it gives the appearance that this is a system of free exchange, right, between, individual free subjects. But the really, I think, interesting, and sort of devastating kind of critical move of capital is to say that, but the appearance is something that can't be taken at face value. If you were to look underneath the appearance, you would actually see that the only way that this system of free exchange is held up is through this very, very brutal, violent system of exploitation that lies underneath the surface in the realm of production itself, and not commercial exchange or circulation is what Marx would describe it as. So to me, I guess the reason why the labor theory of value is kind of the hinge, and it's why people attack Marxism most directly at this point. And it's also, I think, where, if this is the hill you're going to die on, this is the one to do it. Because this is essentially, for a Marxist, where you get your explanation of where exploitation comes from. Right. And inequality and the systemic crises of capitalism, like all of it hinges on the labor theory of value and how you understand production and exploitation to work. So what do you think of that? Does that make sense?
No, that's exactly, what I was going to think was much more thorough than how I would have described it. But that's great. Yeah. So.
All right. That's it. That's the mini episode. We're out of here. Part 2. Anything else before we start tearing through section 2?
Yeah, no, let's jump into chapter 2.
All right. Well, we're going to start off with a little bit of history. We're going to Middle Earth. How fucked up would that be if Mandel just out of nowhere was like, to understand the labor theory of value, we must begin in Middle Earth.
We must start at the Silmarillion.
Real nerd hours here on Red Library. All right. So we're going to start off by talking about a little bit of what pre-capitalist society looked like. Because we talked about in part 1 how capitalism doesn't just mean markets. It means the whole society, the whole system of production has to be based around commodity production. But we need to also understand a little bit about how it came into being. So Mandel basically starts by saying that pre-capitalist society, basically the economy was built solely on the production of use values. And there's a very, very long transitional period between just the production of use values and the full-on capitalist production of mass consumer goods. So Marx basically describes them in terms of, in this transitional period, that you have small-scale commodity production, and that prevails, but it's not generalized throughout society as a whole, and basically doesn't encompass most of what we know as human civilization. Do you have anything you want to touch on that?
Well, I was going to briefly touch on the commodity, money, commodity, and money, commodity, money.
Can I just say before we dive into this, that in Capital, this is one of the hardest sections, I think, for people to work through. And Mandel just fucking dispenses with it in beautiful, elegant fashion in like 2 pages. It's kind of astonishing to see him do this.
Nice.
Nice.
So there's basically 2 different exchange schemes that we want to talk about. One, which is abbreviated CMC, or commodity, money, commodity. And this will be when, for example, a peasant will go to the market with a commodity that they've made. They will sell it to get money. They will then use that money to buy something else that they might need. So participating in the market and selling is specifically done for the purpose of getting some other commodity that they might need. The other scheme would be MCM, or money, commodity, money, in which case the person is buying in order to sell. And this only makes sense if there's excess value, if the selling price is higher than the buying price. And so no longer is basically just selling in order to get something that's useful. It's now that is for the purpose of getting money itself. Yeah,
and Mandel basically says that if you were just to go to the market with money in your hand to buy a commodity and then resell it and basically just get exactly the same price, it would make no sense. Why would you do this? What is the incentive? So the incentive underneath all of this is that there has to be something in this process that allows you to generate some margin of profit in the exchange.
Yeah. And he'll say that we can define capital, which I think this was a little bit interesting definition of capital, a little bit different than a lot of times I've heard it. It'll be capital as the value which is increased by a surplus value. So basically, every time that that money is made in this kind of MCM exchange, that is the creation of capital.
Yeah. And this is going to be really crucial because it's going to allow us to talk about like earlier forms of capital that aren't necessarily the same as what we're going to understand in the capitalist mode of production. And that's going to be really key. So do you mind if I build on that quote a little bit? Because I actually pulled this out. I thought it was really good. Yeah. He says, so capital as CC Don, or Comrade Commissar Don, just described it, just for anyone that doesn't catch that, just make sure, we're a little sharp on this show. Life comes at you fast. So Basically, capital, it therefore exists not only in capitalist society, but in any society founded on small-scale commodity production as well. So that means that capital did exist in this long transitional period before full-on capitalist modes of production. For this reason, it is necessary to distinguish very clearly between the life of capital and that of the capitalist mode of production of capitalist society. Capital is far older than the capitalist mode of production. The former probably goes back some 3,000 years, whereas the latter is barely 200 years old. So yeah, that transitional period is like close to 3 millennia at this point.
Yeah, and I think that's we talked about it some last episode, but is a very good description of, for when people will say, oh, capitalism has existed forever, it's, well, capital has, but maybe not the capitalist mode of production. So these are two distinct concepts.
Yeah, fucking Shapiro right there. Hit him where it hurts. Fucking, that's just straight facts. So I mentioned that there are different types of capital in this transitional period. So Mandel says in pre-capitalist society, surplus value or capital, basically surplus value is capital, is typically in the form of usury or merchant/commercial capital. So just to understand that the capital that we're going to talk about in the capitalist mode of production is different than what was happening in this transitional period, which basically is usury or interest on debts and money being loaned, or basically what a merchant makes. So basically buying and reselling for a greater value in the marketplace.
Yeah. So then I think he wants to move on and then talks about, okay, so if there is this difference between capital and the capitalist mode of production, what does this capitalist mode of production look like? What are its origins and what describes it? The first characteristic of the capitalist mode of production is the separation of the producer from his means of production. So this one he spends a little bit of time talking about, because I don't think it's a little bit as clear from just that brief sentence that he says.
Yeah.
But it basically is that, in other words, people are required to sell their labor on the market. They no longer have the access or the ability to farm land for themselves and live outside the market. They essentially are forced through living through the circumstances of the world, of the market, to participate in it and to sell their labor. Yeah,
I thought he had two really great sort of transitional examples of this. One, He basically says where serfs are bound to the land and the land is bound to them, and that as a social class, they still had some access to the means to sustain themselves and subsist, and they didn't have that economic compulsion to sell their labor power. And then I will say I really love that Mandel brings in a little bit of how the history of colonialism is going to tie into the development of the capitalist mode of production. And he basically also looks at people on the African continent had to be brutally subject to development of basically a sort of colonized nation state and capitalist property relations for that economic compulsion to sell their labor to be present. So the idea is that there has to be some sort of economic incentive, some sort of logic that would cause someone to have to sell their labor. And usually it means that they're just brutally dispossessed of their own means of production. Right. I have a very long Mandel quote here. I don't know if we want to read it.
Okay. Yeah, and was it about the serfs, or because I was going to just mention that briefly before.
Yeah, go for that, and then maybe I'll see if there's something good in this quote.
Yeah, again, as we reiterated last episode, Mandel and other Marxists are not advocating that somehow serfdom was better than capitalism or anything like that. It's just that it is different. And so the fact that the serf is tied to the land gives them some connection to the means of production.
Yeah.
But in capital, in the modes of capitalism, there is now freedom to move, and freedom to sell your labor. And so in some ways this can be maybe more positive, but on the other hand, you are now essentially completely subject to the market.
Yeah. And let's basically say that Mandel's approach, to use our magic word of the day, is dialectical.
Exactly.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Just to tag on a Mandel quote. Oh yeah, I really like this. He's sort of talking about the relationship between this economic compulsion to sell your labor, not only for Indian, Chinese, and Arab workers, but also people sort of in Western and Eastern Europe. He basically says it is simply a function of this constant fact that basically one has to sell their labor on the market. Normally, because of his physical and nervous constitution, no man cares to be confined for 8, 9, 10, or 12 hours a day in a factory, mill, or mine. It really requires the most abominable and unusual force or pressure to make a man engage in this kind of convict labor when he has not been accustomed to it. And so there's actually a really amazing history of this whenever you look at, let's say, Spanish colonization of Central and South America, how they actually tried to basically incorporate the indigenous peoples like into the labor force. And the explanation from the colonizing sort of, mind was that, well, they're just basically too lazy, but a more sort of like, like from the bottom up, like people's history basically shows that no, they were just like violently resisting like the economic compulsion and the logic of capital, and to basically be violently dispossessed of their means of production and basically pressed into slavery.
Yeah.
Well, do you want to touch on the second feature of capitalist modes of production?
Yeah, let's hit number 2. So the second originating characteristic is the concentration of this means of production in monopoly form and in the hands of a single social class, the bourgeoisie.
Yeah, so basically workers are violently dispossessed usually of their means of production, and then those means of production get concentrated into the hands of a single elite upper class, powerful class? I don't know. Fucking the bourgeoisie. That's who they are. Fuck them. I don't care.
I think that it would be, again, most of our listeners are probably very familiar, but since this is a little bit of an introduction, it might be good to just briefly describe like this progression of classes from, and we talked about it some in the Foucault episodes, but this progression of classes from the Middle Ages and feudalism into the start of capitalism. Do you want to...
In like 30 seconds?
I mean, just briefly. I mean, because I remembered when I first, the very first time I read the Communist Manifesto, I was not familiar with a lot of these words, and so I got like pretty confused very early on by what was essentially being talked about.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, where should we start? Do you want to just define like proletariat and bourgeoisie, or like?
I mean, in the Middle Ages, we would have basically peasants and the aristocracy.
Yeah.
And as we transition, so I think most people are probably familiar with those: peasants working the land, the aristocracy who owns the land and is a part of, the nobility and things like that.
Yeah, lords. People like that.
Lords, kings and stuff.
Yeah, so, and I guess the next big sort of development that I typically think about is around the era leading up to the French Revolution, which is basically the development of a sort of proto like bourgeoisie, basically a class that is, they own means of production, they own businesses, and basically they have more wealth, they have more like means of production than like peasants, obviously, and workers, and like sort of a proto form of a proletariat. But they're basically sort of kind of insurgent against the aristocracy as being kind of the elite class, like the dominant class in society, as Mandel would describe, basically those who don't have to like work for the amount of income and wages that they get. So basically, as the Industrial Revolution happens, and essentially as these classes get further and further expanded and concentrated, you see the sort of rise of basically not the only two classes in society, but the one where the main contradiction or tension and conflict lies is basically between this sort of insurgent bourgeoisie that emerged in Western Europe, that was basically overtaking the elite role in society from the aristocracy, and basically the further and further impoverishment of workers being pressed into the wage labor system, which basically are what we call the proletariat. So kind of the main division here of bourgeoisie and proletariat essentially is just a highfalutin way of saying those who owns the means of production, usually a relatively small number of people who control vast amounts of capital and ability to control production, especially in a capitalist system of production, versus the workers or people who don't have means of production and have to sell their labor to the capitalists, and that's the proletariat.
Right. And so there's as you hinted at, there's a period in which the bourgeoisie, would you basically say that they're starting off as like a mercantile class and things like that, more generally? Yeah,
I think it depends on, there are competing debates about where this emerges. Like people like Robert Brenner, like have a very strong theory of how this emerges out of the merchant class. So, I think there are different debates, but yeah.
But anyway, at least for a while, this bourgeoisie was, I guess, second underneath in power the aristocracy. But as capitalism becomes more widespread, becomes more dominant, it's the bourgeoisie that then take over the means of production, and they essentially, dominate over the aristocracy.
Yeah, and I think this is also a question of the transition from a sort of feudal pre-capitalist society to a capitalist one, that in a feudal society, lords are the elite class. They actually control the general way of how society functions, how production works, basically on small plots of land. So essentially, it's a question also of the shift into the capitalist mode of production, and how essentially a new class arises that will then become dominant in that system. And it's very different and distinct than who has power in the feudal system.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So this concentration of the means of production in the monopoly form, and that's one thing we're going to touch on, if not in part 2, then in part 3, is that the logic of the capitalist mode of production leads towards monopoly. It has a sort of inherent incentive and logic to develop in that direction. But basically, this concentration is impossible without constant permanent revolution. It's for all our Trotskyist fans out there. What up, y'all? Constant permanent revolution and means of production, which makes them more costly and complex, and thereby makes a larger barrier to entry to start a business, and it's increasingly difficult due to the initial capital expenditures required. So basically, as these means of production gets concentrated, they get more complicated, becomes harder and harder to basically get access to them, and it makes it increasingly difficult for anyone who doesn't already have capital to basically acquire capital. So let's go ahead and do the third one. So basically you have the third key distinguishing feature, and basically we see the appearance of a social class which has no possessions save its own hands and no means of subsistence other than the sale of its labor power. So basically the proletariat, but at the same time is free to sell this labor power and does so to the capitalist owners of the means of production, i.e. the bourgeoisie. And just to touch on what you were mentioning earlier, he describes it as both a step up and a step back from the serf and slave classes. There is a way that it creates this sort of experience of freedom and sort of a wider expansion and sort of integration of markets and the global system of production. That's maybe the step up, but the step back is obviously the way that the modern form of wage labor is sort of a very unique system of brutality, distinct from slave and serf levels of production.
Right. All right, so do you want to move on to the next section?
What do you have for the next one?
So here's the next section on the origins and definition of the modern proletariat. He goes through like a very brief history of where the proletariat starts. I kind of skipped over that because I didn't really think it kind of talked about where it started, but it actually didn't really describe why it started then and there. So I did think he had a good... On 51, he had a good little summary of what he was talking about, which the producers separated from these means of production are free but deprived of all means of subsistence, and consequently must sell their labor power to the owners of these of the means of production in order to subsist. So that was just kind of I felt like it was a good summary of what he was talking about when it comes to the proletariat.
Yeah, and one quick note I had that Mandel really stresses is that the wages that someone makes, again, does not determine whether they're proletariat or not, but it's whether they're cut off from the means of production, or whatever income they do have doesn't allow someone to work for their own account. So again, just in terms of are we defining who is the proletariat today, for Mandel, is not based on, again, how much money you make. It's about the means of production and your access to those, or whether you're receiving some sort of income that you're not necessarily having to work for, that's being generated by interest, or landlords typically fall into this category now. And we'll come back to this, but I think maybe near the end he has some really great statistical data about this sort of increasing or the diminishing access to the means of production, and basically even like the way that wages and productivity are related, which is a really, really key thing from the late 70s on to now.
Yeah, I thought on 52 he had this interesting method of analysis, which is to kind of look at how many hours or years are required for the average worker to essentially purchase their own business, and talking about how, if it takes, let's see, how long does he say? If we determine that each clerk can, after 10 years of work, put aside a pile of savings which would allow him to purchase a store or small workshop, then we might say that the proletariat condition is regressive, and that we live in a society in which property in the means of production is spreading and becoming generalized. But if we find that the overwhelming majority of workers, manual, white-collar, and governmental, remain the same poor fellows after a life of labor that they were before. In other words, with no savings or not enough capital to buy means of production. We may conclude that the proletariat condition has become generalized rather than contracted. And that is far more prevalent today than it was 50 years ago.
Yeah, and then he goes on to say that over the last 60 years, I guess last 60 years from the date of when he wrote it, the number of workers who, quote, work for themselves has steadily decreased, and the number having to sell their labor power has steadily increased. And so if you look at kind of this in a long arc of history sort of way, we can pretty clearly see that the number of people who actually did have access to the means of production and who could actually start businesses has declined. Mm-hmm. And again, this applies to blue collar and white collar workers. Yeah, I also thought this was really interesting too. He says, moreover, if we examine the statistics on the distribution of private wealth, we find that the overwhelming majority of workers, we may say 95%, and the very great majority of white collar workers, 80 or 85%, are not even able to amass petty sums, small capitals. In other words, these groups expend their entire incomes. So a lot of this has to do with the level of wages you receive, compared to the level of consumption of what you have to consume to and basically pay for to get by. Yeah, there was one other thing too in relation to who owns stock. He says that stock owners, I guess at the time of writing, were only about 2% of workers. So basically 2% of workers who actually own stocks. But even among those workers who do own stocks, the average was that they owned about $1,000 worth of stocks. And he's basically saying this is still not sufficient to actually be in the capitalist class.
Right.
All right. You want to talk about some Daniel consumption? Oh shit, competition. Yeah. Which he says is the fundamental mechanism of the capitalist economy.
Yeah, so competition, as we've all heard, the wonderful part of capitalism, requires...
Is it?
I've always felt like anybody, the main proponents of it, right, will always say that the competition is the great part of it, right?
You know, one of these days, you and I are finally going to get around to reading Corey Robin, his work on the conservative mind, because he basically says that for the conservative mind, the reactionary mind, that there are two realms of the social experience that we have where we get to prove who is the fittest to survive. One is war, the other is the market.
Yeah, I don't know. Everybody that I know that is very much into capitalism loves the competition aspect of it. So.
Why do you think that is? I mean, the people that you know who really glorify competition, do you feel like they're really excelling?
No, absolutely not. No.
Yeah, because most people I know, I'm just like, you're fairly beta in the competition
economically
hierarchy. Beta. Yeah, you're an economic beta. You're an economic virgin. I don't know how helpful it is to put it in the Chad version framework, but
probably doesn't.
No, fuck it, we're doing it anyway because we're Red Library.
That's what we do here on this podcast.
This is what we do on this podcast: just shoehorn in weird meme references to try to understand complex social categories.
To me, it honestly it ends up feeling like I would say it has like two mechanisms. One is that it allows them to not feel any empathy for anybody who is like somewhat, dispossessed in the capitalist economy. So they don't really have to feel bad about or, have any concern for other people who might be struggling. And then I think the other is almost like a defensive mechanism that anytime you get like upset, you feel powerless in the face of a corporation, you're always to just be like, oh, well, there's somebody else that's going to compete with this person. And because they gave me shitty service, I'm going to be able to like go to that thing. And that person, they're eventually, like even though Comcast has a complete monopoly over the area and their customer service is shit, well, eventually they'll probably go out of business or something like that, even though it never actually happens. And that's why I find it to be like a little bit of like a defensive mechanism or something.
That's really fascinating because whenever we get to the point in talking about monopoly, it's only whenever capitalism was in this very, very brief period prior to the period of monopoly capitalism, that would have even been a remote possibility for anybody.
Yeah.
And so that's maybe a really interesting way to think about this for me, is that maybe most of the time whenever we're using that description or people are operating on that logic, it's operating in the logic for capital that only existed for like a fraction of a second in terms of its actual history.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting that might be a lot of the narrative that you absorb about competition and its virtues, is like, well, yeah, I mean, maybe it existed, but it was only for a brief fraction of a moment, like 200 years ago.
I think at least to me, it's always a clear distinction between people who, are like libertarians or capitalists who think that the market is working like the perfect example or the apex of capitalism is like total competition of like a million people all fighting against each other. Whereas I think for the Marxist or something like that, you would say, no, actually the apex of capitalism is the monopoly. Right?
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like libertarians would say, oh, well, the monopoly means, that like, oh, that the government did something wrong, or it's just like a very temporary, it doesn't really last or something like that. But actually, I think that if you, historically, it would be no, like it will always end with monopoly in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, this is why whenever someone basically says that, oh, that's just crony capitalism, that isn't real capitalism, by definition, capital is crony capitalism.
Right.
Like that is it in its truest form. So again, it's really easy to like cleave to that whole like, oh, that's just crony capitalism thing if you just don't think good. Or you haven't read Marx, maybe.
Yeah. No, most people probably have not. So.
That's true. Maybe that's the goal of the show. You know what we should do? We should see if we can get interviewed on like some libertarian podcast. Like we pose as libertarians and then we just start dropping Marx knowledge. I feel like
I think
off.
the problem with that would be that they would just like not publish the episode.
Well, what if we went on there and just said that everything we were saying was what Adam Smith said, because they don't read Adam Smith either?
I could be.
Or like be like, oh, well, this is just Adam Smith and David Ricardo.
It could be. I mean, do you think that they've even heard of David Ricardo?
No. But I think that's why we could pull it off.
That's true.
Yeah. Like, this is everything that Ilhan Omar said.
I like it. Let's try it.
All right. Well, we'll see what happens. Yeah. We'll keep you all posted. Yeah. We'll let you know in part 3.
It's not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, we can dream. I can dream.
Yeah. Imagine it in your minds.
See it in your mind's eye, in your third eye.
Should
we get back on this episode?
Let's maybe get back on track. Okay.
All right.
So competition requires 2 ideas: unlimited market and the multiplicity of decision centers. And when it says unlimited market, it refers to both the expansion of potential products and the expansion of consuming populations. So the market spreads not only to new countries or cultures, but also seeks to create consumers, new consumers, and more purchasing power in current places as well.
Yeah. And this is going to be one of the main drivers of the expansion of markets under colonialism, is basically the way to expand competition and make the market unlimited in different ways. I do want to touch on this too, because whenever we're going to talk about competition, we also have to talk about the understanding of how prices function and what they're basically doing in a system of competition in Marxism. So basically, the only way that we see the levels of production being represented is through the prices of the commodities themselves. So basically, they tell us whether things are being produced in great quantity and there's a plethora, or if there's scarcity. And it only happens after the fact. So even though prices are really abstract and they never like fully line up with the levels of production, it's like they're kind of approximate, and prices fluctuate around there, and it gives us some idea of the actual availability and production of commodities themselves. Now, why this is important is that competition is the main mover of prices themselves. And so I'm going to read a really quick Mandel quote. He says, "A society where competition is radically or completely eliminated would no longer be capitalist, to the extent that there would be no longer a major economic motive for accumulating capital and consequently for carrying out 9/10 of the economic operations which capitalists execute." So basically, no competition, no capitalism, and prices basically are driven by the mechanism of competition itself. Yeah. All right. Do you want to talk about the transition from limited markets to unlimited market? I don't know if that's like a...
I didn't have any notes on that. I just kind of, yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, basically, under pre-capitalist, like the small-scale commodity production, just basically that the market was limited. And in capitalism, this shift over to the capitalist mode of production, the market becomes unlimited based on the two ways that you were describing.
So the next section we have is the growth in the organic composition of capital. So he wants to define C as the conserved value. So this will be like the machines and buildings that money is put into. Mm-hmm. V is the variable capital. This will be the amount that is spent on wages and people. S is the surplus value. So there's always the drive to increase C, to increase the amount of money put into machines and buildings, things that essentially are permanent, and reduce V. So basically we have a ratio C over V, mm-hmm. and C will continue to increase because the surplus value that is created can continue to be invested back into the company. Mm-hmm. And so over time, the C will continue to increase, and there'll also be like an attempt to reduce V in some way, shape, or form, or something like that, right?
Yeah, and this is also related to something about competition as well, that basically competition, the way that you get the edge in competition is to produce things faster, more efficiently than the other people, mm-hmm. The other firms that exist in the same system as you, right? So the idea is that as the production process becomes more complex, that the amount of constant capital that one needs is pretty much like always kind of increasing. It takes more and more investment, buildings, machines, technologies, all this sort of stuff. So that constantly increases to basically capture this higher and higher rate of production. But the level of wages, so basically what you're actually paying the people who are doing the work, that stays relatively constant. And so we're going to see that this is going to be a pretty crucial and devastating sort of like contradiction within capitalism itself and the relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or the workers and the capitalists. So profit can only be realized as surplus value, so that's the V in our little formula here, by the commodities being sold, not just produced. And this is really crucial here. Capital Volume 1 focuses on production, right? But that isn't the whole nature of the system that you have to understand. It isn't just the production. You only realize that value, that surplus value that you basically are capitalizing on by like your sort of system of production by selling those things in the marketplace. So I'm gonna just touch on a couple of points here that I found to be really helpful, that the way that Mandel describes these. So basically, higher productivity means you capture a larger part of the surplus value created in other firms, not just your own. So basically, everyone's producing as fast as they can, right? To sell things as fast as they can. Whenever you have a higher rate of production compared to everyone else, so the social average, it basically means that you're kind of gathering not just your own profit from your own production, but you're actually able to capture the profits that would go to other firms that are either producing at the average or slightly below average. And basically, the more you do that, the more you can transform that surplus value into more constant capital for future expansion of production. So this is going to be really key for why monopoly is sort of the logical consequence of the system of competition, is that the faster you produce, the more profit you then capture from not just your own workers, but everyone in the system of competition, right? And the more you do that, the more you are going to get the advantage of being able to put that back into constant capital to basically further expand your production and your access to more and more complex and expensive technologies and mechanized ways of producing things. So Mandel has this quote here, and it's a little long, but I found this to be really, really a really great sort of description of this. He says, "It is consequently inaccurate to say that it is the capitalist who creates employment." So keep this in mind anytime you hear anyone say that capitalists create the jobs, so they deserve all the profits. Okay. It is consequently inaccurate to say that it is the capitalist who creates employment, since it is the worker who produced the surplus value which was capitalized by the capitalist and used, among other things, for hiring more workers. In reality, the entire mass of fixed wealth we see in the world, the whole mass of plants, machines, roads, railroads, ports, hangars, etc., and so on, All of this enormous mass of wealth is nothing but the materialization of a mass of surplus value created by the workers, of non-reimbursed labor, which was transformed into private property, into capital for the capitalists. It is, in other words, a colossal proof of the continuous exploitation undergone by the working class since the origin of capitalist society. That was actually one of my favorite paragraphs in the whole book.
Good, yeah. And so from there, I think we can lead into how competition will lead to concentration and monopoly.
Mm-hmm.
So I was going to read this quote from him. He says, that is why the Communist Manifesto of Marx and Engels emphasizes the fact that capitalism, which claims to defend private property, is in reality a destroyer of this private property and carries out a constant permanent expropriation of a great number of proprietors by a relatively small number of proprietors. I just highlighted this because I remembered, did I ever tell you the story of when I first read the Communist Manifesto?
No, I don't believe you did.
Yeah, so this was while I was at a very, very conservative Christian college.
Was this assigned or did you read it on?
No. So I'd go to bookstores and buy books, and there was this very small version of the Communist Manifesto for like $1, and I was just like, oh, I've never read it, and it's pretty important. I should take a glance through it. And it was small enough that I could. This was the days before cell phones, or not cell phones, but before smartphones. And I was like, oh, this is small enough that I can just kind of put in my pocket and carry around and things like that. And so I would often, because I was living at the dorms at the time, I'd often use I'd sneak into the faculty bathrooms off hours and basically take a shit there because it was peaceful. And so I was like, oh, this would be perfect to read while I'm doing that. So I just put it in my pocket, go down and just sit on the toilet and I'd start reading the Communist Manifesto.
We've known each other for so long. How have you never told me this story?
Yeah. So, and I was obviously... I was very different from everything that I'd heard from everybody before, because obviously nobody that had ever talked about it had actually ever read it.
Also, like Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember this type of argument was the one that really blew my mind the most, where I think Marx and Engels really talk about how all of these fears of communism, they're actually already being done under capitalism, things like the destruction of the family and also things like the loss of private property. Capitalism is already doing these things and has already been doing these things for a long time. And I remembered reading that, and it took several more years for me to really take a hard left turn. Mm-hmm. But I remembered that was a moment in which I read these things and I was like, well, shit, all these ideas on the left are actually quite different from how I imagined them. And I have very fond memories of sitting there on the toilet reading the Communist Manifesto. So
yeah, that sounds like that was just a peak experience, almost like a slight religious experience. Also, I love how it was sort of almost kind of inherent, the virtual possibility of you becoming just some rabid communist was already there because you were already already violating the norms and the rules by shitting in the faculty bathroom. That's fucking punk as shit, man. I love it. God damn. I feel so blessed. Hashtag blessed that you just shared that story and it's going out to people all over the globe. I got to hear that with them for the first time. That was awesome. Wow. Thankful. Well, since you mentioned this, the thing about destroying private property, just absolutely devastating point that the capitalist system does not defend private property, but destroys it through increasing expropriation of property by bigger and bigger capitalists. And he has this line where he basically says this is the law of the bigger fish, just eat more and more of the smaller fish and you continue to grow until there are only big fish.
Right. Yeah, and so this kind of goes back to that point that we were making earlier about how as the market exists for a longer period of time, that the competition produces concentration. Concentration produces the opposite of free competition, namely monopoly. Where there are few producers, they can readily reach agreement at the expense of the consumers in dividing up markets and preventing any lowering of prices. That's a quote from 64. Mm-hmm. And we see that. We've seen that very explicitly with things like the cable and internet companies around the U.S.,
they're 5 or 6 now?
Yeah, and they would specifically divide up areas and say that they would not compete with one another and keep the prices very high. Mm-hmm. And we went from having the fastest internet to just like atrocious internet within like a decade or something like that. So
let me read another short Mandel paragraph to really flesh this out too, which I thought this was excellent. Naturally, when we speak of monopoly capitalism, we must not in the least presume a capitalism which has completely eliminated competition. There is no such thing, because basically competition is the permanent law of capitalist society. We simply mean a capitalism whose basic behavior has changed. That is to say, it no longer strives for a constant lowering of prices by means of a constant increase in production. It uses the technique of dividing up the market, of setting up market quotas. But this process winds up in a paradox. Why do capitalists who begin as competitors now turn to concerted action in order to limit this competition and to limit production as well? The answer is that it is a method of increasing their profits. They only do so if it brings them more profits. Limiting production permits increasing prices, bringing greater profits, and consequently increased capital accumulation. There it is.
Yep.
What a trash system.
I thought you were pro markets.
I know, it's easy to get that impression from me as I sit here with a hammer and sickle tattooed on my face with my huge surgically implanted Marx beard. I mean, one last thing I'll say about monopoly is that Mandel describes how monopoly in certain branches and sectors led to capitalism's expanse into sectors not in monopoly control, and also into countries which had not become capitalist. So basically, this is where the birth of colonialism and the sort of like race to just expand capital across the globe in the late 19th, early 20th century was then eventually gave rise to the just devastating conflict that we know as World War I, the Great War. The Great War? Sorry.
Is this a reference to something?
No, it's not. It's just something that I was just a brainworm I had. I don't know. Maybe Blackadder, the season 3 when it's World War I, which we need to watch sometime.
Yeah.
But basically, that is really important. It's just there is sometimes like, I think for the older sort of Marxist theories of imperialism, it's just important to understand how the understanding of colonialism and what was the economic incentive is kind of driven by this need to expand markets because monopoly was becoming concentrated in places like Western Europe and the States. All right. What else do you got?
Just going to move on to the next section, which was tendency of the average rate of profit to decline.
Which is still a pretty contentious thing in Marxist theory, how much this is a law.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Explain.
I guess, well, I want to do a little like mini, like 15, 20 minute mini episode on this, that in Capital Volume 3, it's basically where this idea of this, like the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is seen as like a law, like a logical consequence of the Marxist labor theory of value. This is debated. Okay. And it's contended with pretty strongly. But one of the things I really love in Capital Volume 3 is that Marx basically says that if the logic of the capitalist system of production would lead to this because you have greater levels of productivity, but wages continue to basically fall, or basically like people aren't consuming as much, that's what leads to crises. But there's this really brilliant thing that Marx says that I feel like very few people ever talk about, where basically he says that yes, this might be a tendency. It's not a law, it's a tendency, right? But there are countervailing forces that can actually disrupt this tendency. And then he lists off what these are. And I swear, if you read it, it looks like one of the like still most prophetic description of the modern capitalist global economy that I've ever seen. It's amazing. So one of these days I'm going to do that.
Well, I mean, do we want to save this discussion for maybe that?
Yeah. I don't know. Let's finish it off. I feel like that deserves kind of its own separate sort of thing. So we can go over a little bit of Mandel's description of it. So Mandel has this short description here that I think is a little useful. He basically says that capitalism has the tendency to extend production without limits, to extend its arena of activity over the whole world, to view all human beings as potential customers. Parenthetically, this is a pretty contradiction worth stressing. One which Marx already mentioned. Each capitalist always likes to see other capitalists increase the wages of their workers, because the wages of those workers are purchasing power for the goods of the capitalist in question. But he cannot allow the wages of his workers to increase, for this would obviously reduce his own profit. So I guess again, the whole idea of this tendency of the rate of profit to fall is basically related to how much productivity you can squeeze out of your workers. And this is basically kind of underlying the theory of crisis in capitalism. And this is something that's really crucial in Marxist economic theory, is that the nature of capitalism, and I think this maybe goes back to your first question, like, why is this the hill to die on, right? Is that, yeah, like capitalism does create a larger surplus than any other system that we've had. It does free people up to not be bound to the land in the same way. But the thing that is underneath all of it is that this logic creates ongoing and increasingly intense crises of basically like the whole economic system, and it extends more and more to the realm of the entire global system of economic production. Now, before I talk about this theory of crisis and why this is so key, one of the things that Mandel stresses that's really important in how the logic of competition drives the market to expand globally and be unlimited and basically intrude into all these different sectors that normally it wouldn't be in, is that he basically says that this is the progressive socialization of economic life. So basically, more of the globe becomes a single. And I have to say, I thought this was really cool because this is like some Deleuze and Guattari kind of shit. He basically says that the entire global economic system becomes a single assemblage, a single fabric globally, which I just thought was a really cool way to describe it. So the centers of interest basically become smaller and smaller because the number of capitalists becomes smaller and smaller. But it basically sets up the interests of those smaller number of capitalists against the interests of billions across the globe. So we have this increasing tension and potential crisis of the interests of a small handful of people against the interests of billions upon billions of people. So in a capitalist system, a crisis is not a crisis of scarcity as it was in a pre-capitalist society, but it's actually one of overproduction. So basically, capitalism can produce so much that whenever a crisis happens, it's mainly because there's overproduction. So how is it that you can have a crisis whenever there's an overproduction of commodities, right? That's a pretty valid question. So basically, the realization of profits happens in the market, right? Whenever people are buying the goods. But basically, you produce so much that not all those goods can be bought, right? You're producing too much for people to actually consume. So there's a decrease in the realization of profits on the market, and that forces capitalists to suspend their production. And thereby, they lay off workers. And those workers, because they have to sell their wage labor, they have no reserves of significance due to that dependence. So this is where Mandel ends. He says, crises are the clearest manifestation of the fundamental contradiction in the system, and a periodic reminder that it is condemned to die sooner or later, but it will never die automatically. It will always be necessary to give it a conscious little push to effect its demise. And it is our job, comrades. I said comrades, he didn't say comrades. The job of the working class movement to do the pushing, which is kind of an allusion to Marx's idea that capitalism creates its own gravediggers. Yeah, which I still think is one of the most beautiful lines in all of Marx's writings. So basically the idea is that the rate of profit falling is basically because you become so efficient at producing things, you produce too much, you can't actually realize any more profits. And because you can't realize those profits, basically the logic of the system is that, well, if I'm not getting profit out of all the shit that I'm producing and all these wages that I'm paying people, why should I keep paying them? I'll just lay them off. And so that's kind of the idea, is that this is like a further globally expanding sort of process that happens. And that is essentially the core contradiction that leads to capitalist crisis in the system of competition.
Okay.
Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. All right, CC Don, what did you think of all that?
Yeah.
Sounds good?
It's good.
Yeah, sounds pretty good.
So, yeah.
Capitalism is garbage.
I mean, yeah, I feel if you're listening to this podcast, you probably feel that way.
Let me ask you, did you ever think when you were sitting on the shitter in that faculty bathroom that all of that would lead to you sitting here doing this podcast that would be listened to by comrades across the globe?
No, absolutely not. Yeah.
It's funny because whenever I think I thought about even starting a podcast, I'm pretty sure it was also on the shitter.
A lot of good thoughts, man.
There's a
I feel like, yeah, either on the toilet or in the shower, man. That's where all of any thought of substance comes from.
Yeah, it's one of the few times that you're not subject to the logic of competition on the market, you know? That's why taking a very long shit at work on the clock is one of the most revolutionary acts.
Yeah.
A little bit of
all
direct
about
action
that.
there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You got anything else? Should we wrap up here?
No, yeah, I think that we could probably wrap that up.
Well, I guess on to part 3. Probably, I don't know, it might be a little bit before we do part 3. We got a Patreon up next time.
Yeah.
Next week after this. And then
we're going to tell them what we're doing for the Patreon episode?
Yeah, I guess we should. We're going to be discussing the films of Catherine Bigelow, I almost said The Hurt Locker. Is it The Hurt Locker?
Yeah, it is The Hurt Locker. Yeah.
It sounded weird to put the at the start of it. The Hurt Locker and Zero
Dark 30.
We're going to be looking at the fantasies of American imperialism on the systemic level and the individual level.
Yeah, you can. You guys can watch those too in preparation for the episode. But we wouldn't necessarily
24 hours of them.
We wouldn't necessarily recommend it. Yeah,
I do not recommend either of them. Actually, you know what? I would recommend watch the first 30 minutes of each one.
Actually, yeah, that's actually not bad. Yeah.
I wouldn't watch the whole thing, but yeah, just spend an hour, watch the first 30 minutes of each one. You're good. Yeah. We're probably also going to bring in some other feverish dreams of the imperialist mind, such as American Sniper, 13 Hours.
Lone Survivor, maybe?
Yeah.
I haven't seen it, but yeah.
Trying to think of, I don't know, I'm sure we'll... Yeah, I'm going to save my Red Dawn references to whenever we do our Patreon up on that one.
We're
doing a Red Dawn doubleheader. Yeah.
That'll be great.
That is going to be much more enjoyable than the films of Catherine Bigelow.
Yeah. I found them enjoyable only for you and Comrade Alex's responses to them.
We were angry. We were big mad the whole time.
We'll get into it on the episode, but man, yeah. Commissar Alex had a lot of rage that was just being directed all over the place.
I will say, I think we both felt very much like Emperor Palpatine. We were like, good. Yes, give in to your anger. Yeah. And then I shot lightning bolts out of my ass. Well, I guess we'll just fade out into the darkness.
This really? Oh, geez, we've already an hour and 15.
Yeah,
already. Wow.
I mean, come on. These are no longer mini squared series episodes because they're not mini series length. It's a mini series on Mandel. That's it.
Fair.
All right. Well, we'll see you next time.
What does Alex say? We out here?
Yeah. Which I will say is now, I think, like my standard exit for every episode is just like, thanks for tuning in, comrades. We out here. Peace. And now it's time for our special segment of Red Library called Ask Adorno, where our beautiful comrade patrons from around the globe either write in or call in with questions that they would like answered from the legendary Marxist theoretician and philosopher himself, Theodore W. Adorno.
Hello? Is this the machine? Okay, I guess I'll leave a message. Hello, Red Library. My name is Comrade Ryan, and I'm a long-time listener. This is my first time calling, though. I'm calling for some advice. It's still hard for me to talk about this, but, well, I looked through my girlfriend's phone, and, I know, you shouldn't violate your partner's privacy, but, I had a feeling, and, well, basically, I think my girlfriend is cheating on me after dating me for 3 years, and we've been living together for 1. So, I guess my question is, what should I do?
Hey, Comrade Ryan. Thanks for calling in. This is a tough question, but we think Theodore Adorno has some great wisdom to guide you. Adorno says, the relation of knowledge to power is one not only of servility, but of truth. Much knowledge, if out of proportion to the disposition of forces, is invalid, however formally correct it may be. If an emigre doctor says, for me, Adolf Hitler is a pathological case, his pronouncement may ultimately be confirmed by clinical findings, but its incongruity with the objective calamity visited on the world and the name of that paranoiac renders the diagnosis ridiculous. Mere professional preening. Perhaps Hitler is, in himself, a pathological case, but certainly not for him. The vanity and poverty of many of the declarations against fascism by émigrés is connected with this. People thinking in the forms of free, detached, disinterested appraisal were unable to accommodate within those forms the experience of violence, which in reality annulled such thinking. The almost insoluble task is to let neither the power of others nor our own powerlessness stupefy us. Thanks again so much for calling in, Comrade Ryan. We hope that some of Adorno's wisdom has helped answer your question. And until the next time on Ask Adorno, take care of yourselves out there, comrades. All right, a successful day at the podcast factory. We're shutting down the machines. We're closing it out. Remember, next week we will not have a free release episode as we are now shifting over to our new release schedule. Next week will be a patron-only exclusive. Me, Comrade Commissar Don, and Comrade Commissar Alex are going to be discussing the imagination, the fantasy of the American imperialist mind by watching two films by Catherine Bigelow, Zero Dark 30 and The Hurt Locker. We were definitely in the Hurt Locker for both of them, as we were trying to figure out exactly what the hell the Hurt Locker was. So if you're interested to check that out, remember, head over to Patreon, $1 a month or a quarter an episode. You can get access to that coming up, and join all the other new patrons that have been opting in to our podcasting cadre, if you will, our lefty content microsect. No, that's not what we want. We don't want a microsect. We want the opposite of that, whatever that is in podcasting language. We got lots of new great episodes coming your way very, very soon. We're going to be kicking off our new reading series on Todd McGowan's Capitalism and Desire, The Psychic Cost of Free Markets, with our podrad Neil from the From 78 podcast, and also a fellow podcast on our network, the Lost Horizons Network, which you can find more info about in the show notes. Remember to support our other podrads at The Regrettable Century, as we are now the three spears of the leftist podcasting trident of dialectical pessimism. Again, big shout out to all of our new patrons who are joining us over the last week or two. Again, we really appreciate y'all's support. It's part of why we do this. We just love to share our own interest, our own enthusiasm, our passion for leftist politics, for putting out a perspective on what's happening in the world from the dialectical pessimist point of view, trying to read hard-ass theory, engage in icy cold motherfucking analysis, icy liquid hot magma level takes, all that other good stuff. Hopefully that's what you've come to know us for. That's our brand. You can expect the third and final part of our Ernest Mandel Mini Squared episode series coming up probably in mid to late March, and we really hope you enjoyed part 2. We certainly did. And I'm sure part 3 is going to be 4 hours long in true Mini Squared episode fashion. Until we see you back here in a few weeks, comrades, remember, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, keep fighting, keep dreaming, keep hoping, keep thinking, keep analyzing, keep critically reflecting, stay hydrated, stay motivated, stay liberated, and remember, we out here. We are definitely out here. Don't forget, Red Library out. Peace.